Hello and welcome to a special two-parts note in which we're going to be discussing this book, The Trouble with Europe. Now, plainly here in Britain we've been debating our relationship with the rest of the European Union for literally as long as I can remember. In the last few years it's become a matter of passionate debate across Europe. Let's try to have a dispassionate economic look at the costs and benefits of the European Union. So let me now welcome the author, my guest, Roger Bootle. Thanks very much for joining me. Now, when Europe started, it was a club of 6 wealthy countries. Is there an argument that it was even then flawed by design, even at its first stage?
I think it was flawed by design, that the objective with which it was established was to move towards ever closer union between these countries, without it being really clearly envisaged exactly how this was going to work. And so we've had some of the key elements of some sort of common entity, for instance the single currency, developed much later than the Union was founded, and in the process of that discovering all sorts of problems. However, I think if the Union had stayed with those just original 6 member countries, many of the difficulties that have subsequently emerged wouldn't have done so. It's been this fantastic expansion, which I think has greatly increased the problems.
Okay, so let's look at that in a little more detail. This is what the first EEC looked like, and then we get to the first great expansion. We have another chart to show that, and plainly, once you have the expansion in the last decade, the Union becomes a much poorer place. I mean, how does that add to the stresses? Can we say that it was flawed by design at that point?
Well, I think actually the expansion of the EU to include what I call the refugee countries from the former Eastern Bloc is one of the EU's great achievements. This is a sense in which, I'm not one of those raving Eurosceptics who thinks that the EU has been the work of the devil. I think it's been a fantastic achievement. Essentially what's happened is the EU has acted as a receiving house for these countries. And in moving to join the EU and subsequently staying in the EU, these countries have done a lot of things. That's something to be thankful for. However, what happened when these much poorer, less developed countries came in is that the character of the Union changed dramatically. It's one thing, for instance, to have the idea of free movement of labour between 6 countries that are essentially at the same stage of development. It's quite another when you throw your doors open to much, much poorer countries. You end up with not just the flows across borders, but frankly the fears about flows across borders, which in many cases, of course, are greatly in excess of the reality.
Okay, now obviously this issue becomes even more intense if we take a look at the kind of countries that are projected or hopeful of joining, where there were originally supposed to be advantages from scale, weren't there? Are there any? Is there any economic evidence that the fact that the EU is a large entity has helped to their own benefits, for example, from trade, which is one of the key early aims?
Well, there's some evidence, but it's not very compelling. If you look at trade patterns over the last 10, 15 years, there's not a great deal to convince one that the EU has vastly increased trade, because what's happened over that period, of course, is that global trade has increased tremendously. So if you look at any of the key members, whether it's France or Germany or whatever, yes, they're doing more trade with each other, but they're doing even more trade with the newly emergent countries around the world. China, for instance, German trade with China has absolutely taken off.
Okay, now in terms of economic growth, let's leave the last few years aside, just to give Europe the benefit of the doubt on that one. Up until 2007, 2008, was it fair to say that Europe had delivered any extra economic growth?
If you look at just the bare facts, the story is this. Immediately after the formation of the Union, there was a great boom in Europe, most of Europe. Mind you, there'd been a boom starting before then, actually. So again, you can't quite attribute the boom to the formation of the Union, but there was strong economic growth in, I think, all those member countries, as well, actually, in some countries that weren't members. And then gradually the growth rate slowed down. If you compare growth in the Union with growth in countries not in the Union, both in Europe and elsewhere around the world, you find that over the last couple of decades, the EU has been an underperformer. And that underperformance has been accentuated since the formation of the euro. If you go back to 99 and look at growth in the eurozone compared to growth in other countries around the world, far from it looking as though the eurozone countries have done well, they've done relatively poorly.
Okay, Roger, thank you very much for now. So, on a cost-benefit analysis, it doesn't look at all clear that Europe has done very well at all, even before it slid into crisis. In the second part, we're going to be dealing with the much tougher issue of how we need to sort it out.